It was one of those nights the rain didn't just fall, it hammered the roof like it was trying to wash the whole world clean. I sat at my kitchen table in the old Harper farmhouse. The same table my grandfather had built with his own hands, staring at a cold cup of coffee and the stack of farm ledgers that never seemed to get any smaller. At 38 years old, I had grown used to the quiet. My parents had been gone 5 years now, Mom to cancer. Dad to a heart that just couldn't keep going after she left. The land was mine, all 240 acres of it, passed down through 4 generations. I knew every fence post, every low spot that flooded in spring, every oak that had stood since before the Civil War. But the house itself felt too big, too empty. Most nights I'd come in from the fields, shower off the dirt, heat up whatever frozen meal I had left, and listen to the wind move through the rooms like it was looking for someone who wasn't there. That night, though, the silence broke at 11:47 with 3 sharp knocks on the front door. I froze. Nobody came out here this late, especially not in a storm like this. I grabbed my flannel jacket, flipped on the porch light, and opened the heavy oak door. There she stood, Emily Walker, drenched to the bone, rain streaming down her face, mascara tracking black lines down her cheeks. She clutched a thick manila folder against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her from drowning. Her eyes, those same bright hazel eyes I remembered from when she was a kid running through the corn rows between our 2 farms, were wide with panic. "Jake," she said, voice cracking, "I need a husband by Friday." For a second I just stood there, rain blowing in sideways, soaking the welcome mat my mother had cross-stitched 20 years ago. Emily Walker, Tom and Linda Walker's daughter from the farm right next door. I'd known her since she was 8 years old, tagging along behind her dad when he came over to borrow the combine. I'd watched her grow up, school plays, 4-H ribbons, the day she left for college with her whole future shining in front of her. She was 24 now, and she looked like her entire world had just collapsed. "Emily, what the hell are you talking about?" I asked, stepping back so she could get out of the rain. She didn't move at first, just stood there shaking. "It's Dad's will," she finally said, the words tumbling out between sobs. "He put a condition in it, to fully inherit and control the farm. I have to be legally married by my 25th birthday. That's this Friday. If I'm not married, the whole place goes into a trust that Grant can access. He's already taken the house keys and the barn keys. He's been bringing developers around, showing them the land, talking about tearing down the old barn and putting up 50 cookie-cutter houses. The debts he ran up during our marriage. I can't fight it by myself. I need to be married by Friday or I lose everything Dad spent his whole life building." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Tom Walker had been a good man, quiet, honest, the kind who'd give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. We'd traded equipment, helped each other during harvest, shared beers on summer evenings while the sun set over both our fields. The thought of some slick ex-husband destroying that legacy made my jaw tighten. I gently took her arm and guided her inside. "Come on, you're freezing." I led her to the living room where the fire I'd built earlier was still crackling. I grabbed the thick wool blanket from the back of the couch, Mom's favorite, and wrapped it around her shoulders. Then I went to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and found the chamomile tea she used to like when she was little. While the water heated, she opened the folder on the coffee table and started spreading out papers, legal documents. The will itself, old photos of the farm, bank statements showing the mountain of debt Grant had left behind. She told me everything. The short, miserable marriage, the affairs she'd discovered, the divorce that had been finalized just 8 months before her father died. How Grant had somehow found out about the marriage clause in the will and was using it like a weapon. Calling her at all hours, showing up unannounced, threatening to sell the land out from under her to pay his debts. "I've tried everything, Jake," she whispered, staring into the fire. "Lawyers, extensions, even offering to buy him out. Nothing works. He knows the deadline is Friday. He knows if I'm not married, he wins." I handed her the steaming mug and sat across from her in the old leather chair that still smelled faintly of my father's pipe tobacco. For a long moment I didn't speak. I just watched the firelight play across her face, the same face I'd seen laughing in the fields when she was 16. The same face that had looked so lost at her father's funeral 6 months ago. And I thought about my own life. The empty rooms, the nights I lay awake listening to the coyotes howl, the way the land had started to feel more like a burden than a blessing. Here was Emily, offering me a chance to protect something that mattered, to stand between her and the man who wanted to erase her family's history. "Emily," I said finally, my voice steady even though my heart was pounding harder than the rain on the roof. "I'll do it. I'll marry you." Her head snapped up. Fresh tears filled her eyes. But these ones looked different, like hope cracking through the storm. "Just a paper marriage," she said quickly. "We can get it annulled the day after the deadline. I swear I won't make any trouble. You won't even have to change your life. I just need the certificate so the lawyer can sign off and the trust dissolves." I shook my head. "No. If we're doing this, we do it right. No lies. No games. We treat each other with respect. You move in here if you need to, whatever it takes to make this look real to the court and to the town. We protect the farm together. Deal?" She stared at me for a long second, then nodded slowly. "Deal. Thank you, Jake. I don't know what I would have done." We sat there for another hour. The storm still raging outside but something warmer settling inside the old walls. I told her about the spare bedroom upstairs. The one with the quilt her mother had made for my parents years ago. She told me she'd bring the last of her things over tomorrow after the courthouse. We talked about what we'd say to people in town, the simple story that we'd been quietly seeing each other for months and decided to make it official before the deadline. When she finally stood to leave, the rain had eased to a steady drizzle. I walked her to the door, umbrella in hand. Before she stepped out, she turned and looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time that night. "You've always been the steady one, Jake Harper. Even when we were kids, I should have known you'd be the one I could count on." I watched her walk down the gravel drive toward her truck, the red taillights disappearing into the mist. Then I closed the door, leaned my forehead against the cool wood, and let out a long breath. My neighbor's daughter had come to my door in the middle of the worst storm of the year and asked for the one thing I never thought I'd give anyone again. And I had said yes. The next morning the sun rose like it was apologizing for the storm. Clear blue sky, birds singing in the big oak by the barn, dew sparkling on every blade of grass. I woke up before my alarm, lying there in the dark listening to the house creak the way it always did. Only this time it felt different. Today I was getting married. Not for love, not for forever, just for a piece of paper that would save Emily's farm and maybe, in some quiet way, give me back a piece of purpose I'd lost 5 years ago. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, running the razor over my jaw the way my dad had taught me. The only suit I owned hung on the back of the door, the charcoal one I'd worn to both my parents' funerals. I straightened the tie 3 times before I got it right. "You're doing the right thing," I told the man in the mirror. "This is about legacy, about helping someone who needs it. That's all." Emily pulled up at 8:30 sharp in her old blue truck. She wore a simple cream dress that looked like it had been waiting in the back of her closet for years. Hair pulled into a neat ponytail. Just a touch of gloss on her lips. She carried one small overnight bag and that same thick manila folder. When she stepped out, the morning light caught her face and for a second I forgot how to breathe. "You look nice," I said, then immediately wished I'd kept my mouth shut. She smiled anyway, that small, tired, grateful smile that was starting to do something dangerous to my chest. "You clean up pretty well yourself, Jake Harper." We drove to the county courthouse in my truck with the windows down. An old George Strait song played on the radio about second chances and starting over. Neither of us reached to change it. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable yet, it was just full. Full of everything we'd said last night and everything we hadn't. The clerk barely glanced up when we walked in. "Marriage license?" she asked, sliding the forms across the counter like she'd done it 1,000 times. We filled them out side by side. Emily's hand trembled when she signed her name. Without thinking, I reached over and steadied it with mine. She didn't pull away. Judge Harlan was an old friend of my father's. He looked at us over the top of his glasses and raised one bushy eyebrow. You two sure about this? We're sure, I answered, and Emily nodded beside me, her voice soft but steady. The ceremony took less than 10 minutes. No music, no flowers, just the two of us standing in front of his big wooden desk with the American flag behind him and the morning sun streaming through the blinds. I said my vows in a voice that sounded calmer than I felt. Emily's voice cracked once on, "Till death do us part." But she pushed through. When the judge said, "You may now kiss the bride," we both hesitated for half a heartbeat. Then I leaned in and pressed the lightest kiss to her cheek. Her skin was warm from the sun. She smelled like fresh air and the wildflowers that grew along the fence line. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Harper," Judge Harlan said, signing the certificate with a flourish. "May your years be long and your fields fruitful." We walked out into the bright morning as husband and wife on paper. Emily let out a shaky little laugh once we were back in the truck. That was surreal. "Yeah," I said, starting the engine, "but it's done. The farm is protected now." Back at the house, the real part began. I carried her bag upstairs to the spare bedroom, the one with the big east window that looked out over the pasture where the morning light hit just right. The quilt on the bed was one her mother had made for my parents years ago. Emily stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking around. "I don't want to be in your way," she said quietly. "I'll pull my weight. Teach me the accounts, the suppliers, the schedule for the hands. I'm not here to hide behind a marriage certificate. I want to learn how to run this place the way my dad would have wanted." I nodded. "Good, because I'm not looking for a guest. We're partners now. 3 rules. Rule 1. No lies. Not to each other, not to the town, not to the lawyer. Rule 2. We eat dinner together every night. Rule 3. If either of us wants out after the deadline, we say so straight. No hard feelings. Deal?" She held out her hand. "Deal." We shook on it, and something in the air between us shifted, just a little. But enough that I noticed. That afternoon we spent 3 hours in the barn office going over the books. I showed her the spreadsheets, the feed orders, the vet records, the fence repairs I'd been putting off. She asked good questions, took careful notes, and when I mentioned we needed a new bull before breeding season, she suggested checking the auction in the next county instead of paying the inflated price at the local sale barn. I was impressed. Tom Walker had raised a daughter who understood this life. By late afternoon the sun was starting to slide toward the horizon, painting everything gold. I fired up the grill on the back porch while Emily made a salad from the garden I'd let get a little wild. We ate at the kitchen table under the old chandelier my mother had loved, the one that still flickered when the wind blew just right. At first the conversation stayed safe: cattle prices, the new highway project that might cut through the back 40, the weather forecast for the weekend. But then she asked about my parents. And before I knew it I was telling her stories I hadn't shared with anyone in years. How my mom used to sing while she canned tomatoes. How my dad taught me to drive the tractor when I was barely tall enough to reach the pedals. She listened like she really wanted to know. And when it was her turn, she told me about her father's last weeks. How he'd made her promise to keep the farm no matter what. He said the land remembers who loves it, she whispered, staring into her glass of water. I think he was right. After dinner we washed the dishes together, shoulders brushing at the sink. The old house settling around us with its familiar creaks and groans. Neither of us mentioned the spare bedroom or the fact that we were now legally married. The silence felt comfortable. Later, when I lay in my bed upstairs and heard her moving around in the room down the hall, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind in the oak trees. For the first time in 5 years, the farmhouse didn't feel empty. It felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what the two of us would do next. The days after the wedding settled into a rhythm I hadn't expected. Every morning I woke to the smell of coffee already brewing downstairs. Emily was up before me most days, already dressed in jeans and one of my old flannel shirts she'd borrowed. Hair braided back, boots by the door. She'd hand me a mug without a word and we'd walk out to the barn together like we'd been doing it for years instead of days. She learned fast, faster than I thought possible. I showed her the feed supplier spreadsheets. The vaccination records. The way I tracked the herd by ear tag numbers. She took it all in. Asked questions that proved she wasn't just nodding along. Then started making suggestions that actually made sense. On the third morning she stood in the middle of the south pasture with her hands on her hips and told Old Man Miller, one of our seasonal hands, that the fence along the creek needed replacing before the next rain or we'd lose half the herd. Miller looked at me like he was waiting for me to overrule her. I just shrugged and said, "She's right. Get it done." Word spread through town faster than I expected. By the end of the first week, every time I stopped at the feed store or the diner, someone had something to say. "Heard you and the Walker girl tied the knot." Old Pete at the counter said with a knowing grin. "Kinda sudden, ain't it?" I gave him the story we'd agreed on, quiet courtship. Decided to make it official before her birthday deadline, and he nodded like he believed it. Most people did, but I could feel the eyes on us whenever we went into town together. Emily handled it better than I did. She smiled, answered politely, and never once let the mask slip. Grant didn't stay quiet for long. He showed up on the fourth day, driving that shiny black truck of his like he owned the place. Emily and I were in the east field checking the new calves when we saw him pull up to the main gate. He had two men in suits with him, developers. I guessed. They were walking the fence line, pointing at the land like it was already theirs. Emily didn't hesitate. She climbed into the truck and drove straight over. I followed on foot, heart pounding harder than it should have. By the time I got there, she was already out of the cab, standing toe to toe with Grant while the two suits hung back. "You don't have permission to be on this property," she said, voice steady and cold. "This is my land, my father's land, and now my husband's land too." Grant laughed that slick laugh I'd only heard about. "Your husband? Please, everyone knows this is a paperwork marriage. Emily, you needed a warm body to satisfy the will. Jake here is just doing you a favor. Once the deadline passes, he'll be gone and this place will be mine to sell." I stepped up beside her then, close enough that our shoulders touched. "You heard her, Grant. Get off our land, now." He looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Maybe he was. For years I'd been the quiet neighbor who kept to himself. But something in his eyes shifted when he realized I wasn't backing down. He muttered something under his breath, got back in his truck, and peeled out, kicking up gravel. The two suits followed without a word. Emily stood there breathing hard, fists clenched at her sides. I put a hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" She nodded, but her eyes were shining. "He's not going to stop, Jake, not until he gets what he wants." "Then we don't stop either," I said. "We make this place run so smooth the lawyer has no choice but to sign off." That night the rain came back, soft at first, then steady. We were in the kitchen finishing dinner when my phone rang. It was Miller. "Boss, the east gate's open. I don't know how, but the herd's out. They're heading toward the highway." We were in the truck in under 2 minutes. The rain was coming down hard now, headlights cutting through sheets of water. We found the cattle scattered across the lower pasture, some already dangerously close to the road. Emily didn't wait for instructions. She jumped out, grabbed a flashlight and a rope, and started herding the closest ones back toward the open gate like she'd been doing it her whole life. For the next hour we worked in the downpour, slipping in mud, shouting over the thunder, soaking wet and freezing. At one point a young heifer broke toward the highway and Emily took off after it without hesitation. I caught up just as she slipped in the mud. I grabbed her arm to steady her and we both went down in a tangle of legs and laughter that turned into something else when our eyes met. We got every last animal back inside the fence. By the time we closed the gate and latched it, we were both drenched, covered in mud, and breathing like we'd run a marathon. Emily leaned against the truck, rain streaming down her face, and looked at me with something I couldn't quite name. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Any of this, the wedding, the farm, chasing cattle in the rain." I stepped closer, close enough to see the water droplets clinging to her eyelashes. "Yeah, I did, because somewhere along the way this stopped being about the will and started being about you. About us." She reached up and touched my face, thumb brushing rain from my cheek. Then she kissed me, really kissed me, for the first time. Not for show. Not for the judge. Just for us. Standing in the mud and the rain with the herd safe behind us and the whole world narrowed down to that single moment. When we finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against mine. I don't want this to end after Friday, Jake. Neither do I whispered. We drove back to the house in silence. But it wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything we'd just admitted without saying the words out loud. We showered separately, changed into dry clothes, and met back in the kitchen where I made hot cocoa the way my mom used to. We sat at the table until almost midnight, talking about everything, her childhood on the farm, my years alone after my parents died, the dreams we both had for this land. When she finally stood to go upstairs, she paused in the doorway and looked back at me. "Good night, husband," she said with a small, real smile. "Good night, wife." And for the first time since that stormy night she knocked on my door. I went to bed knowing the house wasn't just full of two people trying to survive a deadline. It was full of something that felt a whole lot like home. Friday arrived with clear skies and a nervous quiet that settled over the whole farm. Emily and I barely spoke over breakfast. We both knew what was coming. At 10 o'clock we had an appointment with the estate lawyer, Mr. Patterson, the same man who had read Tom Walker's will 6 months earlier. Grant had demanded to be present, and the lawyer had agreed. I could see the tension in Emily's shoulders as she gathered the thick folder she'd been building all week, receipts, bank statements, contracts, letters from suppliers and workers, everything proving she had taken full operational control of the farm. "You ready?" I asked as we climbed into the truck. She looked at me, and for the first time since that rainy night she knocked on my door. There was no fear in her eyes, only determination. "I'm ready. Because of you, Jake. I couldn't have done any of this without you." We drove in silence, but it wasn't empty. Her hand found mine on the seat between us and stayed there the whole way. The lawyer's office was in the old brick building downtown, the kind with high ceilings and heavy wooden furniture that smelled like old paper and success. Grant was already there when we arrived, lounging in one of the leather chairs like he owned the place. He smirked when we walked in. "Well, look at the happy couple," he said. "Enjoying your little arrangement?" Emily didn't even glance at him. She sat down beside me, placed the folder on the table, and folded her hands in her lap. I reached over and gave her knee a gentle squeeze under the table. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat and opened the file in front of him. "As you all know, the condition in Thomas Walker's will is clear, for Emily to inherit full operational control of the farm without it falling into the trust. She must be legally married by her 25th birthday and demonstrate active management of the property. Today we're here to verify whether that condition has been met." Grant leaned forward. "It's a sham marriage. Everyone in town knows it. They got hitched 3 days before the deadline just to check a box. She's not running the farm, he is." Emily spoke then, her voice calm and steady. "That's not true, and I have the proof." She opened the folder and began sliding documents across the table one by one. "These are paid invoices for the last 3 weeks, feed, veterinary services, fence repairs, equipment maintenance, all paid from the farm account that I now control. Here are the renegotiated supplier contracts with better terms I secured myself. Here are signed statements from 3 of our longtime hands confirming I've been on site daily, giving orders, and making decisions. Here is the record of the cattle we recovered after the East Gate incident, including the vet bill I paid personally." She kept going, her voice never wavering. Grant's smirk slowly faded as page after page proved she wasn't just playing house, she was running the place like she'd been born to it. When she finished, the room was silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Mr. Patterson adjusted his glasses and studied the documents for a long moment. Then he looked up at Grant. "Mr. Thompson, it appears the condition has been satisfied. Emily Harper has demonstrated clear operational control. The trust clause is nullified. The farm remains fully under her ownership and management." Grant shot to his feet, face red. "This is ridiculous. You can't just." "I can. And I have," the lawyer said firmly. "The matter is closed. Congratulations, Mrs. Harper. The farm is yours, free and clear." Grant stormed out without another word, slamming the door so hard the pictures on the wall rattled. Emily sat very still for a second, then let out a long, shaky breath. I reached over and took her hand properly this time. Not under the table. You did it, I said quietly. We did it, she corrected, squeezing my fingers. We drove home in the golden afternoon light, the windows down, the wind carrying the scent of fresh cut hay. Neither of us said much. We didn't need to. When we pulled up to the house, Emily got out and walked straight to the fence line that divided our two properties, the same fence I'd been looking at alone for 5 years. I followed her. She leaned against the weathered wood, looking out over the fields that now belonged to her completely. I stood beside her, close enough that our arms touched. Jake, she said after a while, voice soft, you could have walked away after today. The deal is done. The paper is signed. You don't owe me anything anymore. I turned to face her. The sun was low behind her, turning her hair to gold. For a moment I couldn't find the words. Then they came out in a rush, honest and raw. I'm not walking away, Emily. I never was. I told myself at the beginning this was just to help you. To protect Tom's legacy. To give you a fighting chance. But somewhere between chasing cattle in the rain and watching you stand up to Grant in that office today, I realized I stayed because I found something I didn't even know I was missing. I found home. I found you. I love you. Emily Walker Harper. Not on paper. For real. For keeps. Her eyes filled with tears. But she was smiling, the biggest, brightest smile I'd ever seen on her face. She stepped into my arms and kissed me like she was sealing a promise we both intended to keep for the rest of our lives. When we finally pulled apart, she rested her head against my chest and whispered, I love you too, Jake. I think I have for a long time. We stood there at the fence line as the sun dipped lower. The two farms stretching out behind us like they'd always been meant to be one. No more storms, no more deadlines, no more pretending. Just us, together, exactly where we were supposed to be.